Okay, good morning, y'all. My name is Miss Glass, and I'm going to be doing a presentation today on the agricultural South. Okay, so for our bell ringer, there was a picture of settlers and Native Americans. As you can see, the Native Americans are looking on at the settlers. And we talked about some of this last week. What were some of the attitudes that the Native Americans had toward the settlers, or vice versa?
Negative.
It was negative. There was hostility and it was hatred.
They were scared.
Okay, they were scared. Very good. All those are very true. So, in talking about the Native Americans and the settlers, these settlers are going to move further south into new lands, into the territories of North Carolina, into Georgia, into Alabama. And they're going to be doing some of the same things, forming tobacco, rice, sugar, indigo. And that's going to cause them to need more labor. And can anybody guess where they're going to get that labor from? From who? From the they did get it from the natives at first, but the Native Americans are not going to be, they know the land too well, so they can escape from slaves. So it's going to start the Middle Passage in the Triangle of Trade where they transported slaves to the Americas. So this is a quote from one of those slaves from Africa that were on the boat. This is what he said about the conditions on the ship coming to America from Africa. He said the closeness of this place and the heat of the climate added to the mass number in the ship so crowded that no one could turn himself, almost suffocated us. This produced copious perspirations. Copious means many smells, basically. Copious means many. Perspiration, smells. Which brought on a sickness among the slaves, of which many died. So can y'all imagine how the slaves felt inside of those quarters? He said that it was hot, the smell was bad, and it almost suffocated them. That's how bad the voyage was. So how do you think that they felt, the slaves, being down there, being taken from their land? Scared. Mad, angry, yep.
It looked like they were locked up.
Yeah, they were locked up, they were chained together, right. So these are some common misconceptions that I hear a lot of people say. Slaves were only shipped to the Americas. That's not true. Slaves were shipped to Jamaica, Haiti, Cuba, and other islands as well. So North America was just one of the many stops. They only picked cotton. They didn't just pick cotton. They cropped tobacco, indigo, rice, molasses, and other things as well. Africans sold slaves as well, so they were traders, they were no better. And we kind of talked about some of this last week. They did not just sell and kidnap regular people. They kidnapped people that they did not deem worthy to be there. People who committed crimes, people that weren't worthy. And all Africans were poor. We hear that a lot, all Africans are poor. Or were poor. That's not true. They had a lot of culture. They grew their food. They had family. They had a lot of rituals and traditions. They were not all poor. And we're going to get into that. So the guy that the quote came from, his name was Equiano Aluade. He was kidnapped from Africa and sent to the Caribbean. And he was able to buy his freedom. And from there, he became an abolitionist. He moved to England, and he wrote a book, a memoir, where he talked about some of the things that went on. He says he refers to a man called the Oye Obe in his village, who brought goods like guns, gunpowder, and dried fish. In return, Equiano says, sometimes indeed we sold slaves to them. He's talking about his people. We did sell slaves to them. But they were only prisoners of war or such among us that had been convicted of kidnapping or adultery and some other crimes which were esteemed heinous. Heinous means it was very bad. It was like unforgivable. That's what heinous means. So, this is one of the ports in Ghana in West Africa where slaves were taken from. This is where they were loaded onto ships by the water and taken across. And they didn't know where they were going. They called a lot of it the door of no return. They didn't know where they were going, but they weren't coming back. They were put onto these ships, and they were shipped off. And this is one of those ports in Ghana. This is another one. This is a slave route where the slaves were taken, put into ships. This one is in Nigeria. Ghana and Nigeria are West African countries located by the water. Okay, so we're going to get into talking about some of the things we discussed today. We're going to talk about cash crops, slaves, the triangular trade, the Middle Passage, Oluwado, Agriano, who we just discussed, and slave revolts such as the Stono Rebellion. This is a picture of the triangular trade. This is Africa here. Ghana and Nigeria, the countries I just discussed, they're located in this area. So Europeans will come and get slaves from Africa, and then they would transport them to the Americas. And they also stopped in countries such as Jamaica, Cuba, and Haiti along the way. And then those slaves made goods like tobacco, cotton, indigo, and they transported it back to Europe. And it continued. You see why they call it the triangular trade? So they would trade in slaves and goods back and forth from Africa, Europe, and America. Okay, before we begin, we're going to watch a video on some of those things we discussed about how slaves felt being on those ships.
Historians estimate that between 1500 and 1870, more than 11 police. On March 9, 1841, the Supreme Court of the United States announced its decision.
It is the ultimate right of all human beings in extreme cases to resist oppression and to apply force against ruinous injustice.
Senator P.A. and the other captives were freed. The United States Supreme Court had recognized these Africans as free human beings. Although the Atlantic slave trade came to an end in the 1800s, the damage had been done. African societies were disrupted by depopulation and warfare. Some 2 million people had died on slave ships, and millions more had been forced to endure.
That's pretty good. Okay, so as you saw from the video, you saw how the conditions were on the ship.
Yeah.
You saw some of the things that the slaves had to go through and endure. You also saw that there was a revolt where they took over the ship themselves and tried to go back to Africa, and it was a big case. It's a movie called Amistad. Y'all ever seen that movie or heard of it?
I watched that movie.
Right, it is a big movie about it. So as you'll see a lot of revolts, such as that one, such as the Stono Rebellion that we'll get to. All right, let's get to our discussion. Let's talk about the agriculture of the South and how they needed slaves and why they needed these slaves. Throughout the 1600s and 1700s, the American colonies grew and prospered. They also grew into two distinct regions, North and South. Colonies in the South created a society based on farming. A typical lower southern farm or plantation grew a single cash crop, a crop grown for sale rather than for the farmer's use. These included tobacco, rice, and indigo. Indigo is like a purple dye that people use to make things, to create art or whatever. Few major cities developed in the South. One reason for that, plantations usually were located along the rivers. This meant that farmers could transport their goods to the northern colonies in Europe without the need for city docks. So in the South, the economy was good for trade because there was a lot of rivers and stuff, and they could just directly put the goods into ships and ship it up south. So it was a benefit. Another reason for the absence of large towns in the South was that farmers could store their goods on their plantations. Thus, they did not need city warehouses. Furthermore, plantation owners produced much of what they needed, so there was no reason for shops and bakeries. There were a few major cities in the South, such as Charlestown, later Charleston, and South Carolina. However, Southern society was mostly rural, meaning it means that it was mostly field and farm-based, rural. So why were there few cities in the South? We just discussed it. because it was a rural society. So cities didn't need to, they just wanted to farm crops there. That's what the land was used for, mainly. What was Southern life like? So most Southerners worked small farms. The few wealthy plantation owners or planters controlled the economy. They also controlled much of the South's social and political life. Southern women could not vote, attend school, or own property. They worked long hours on the farms and in the house. The South's many indentured servants also had few rights. Indentured servants were mainly white European males who exchanged their trip to North Carolina for several years of farm labor. Many indentured servants hoped to start a new life once their servitude was over. However, once they completed their terms of labor, most indentured servants had a difficult time trying to survive. Throughout the 1600s, the number of indentured servants in the South decreased. As a result, planters faced a labor shortage on their plantations. They soon turned to the use of African slaves. So, the indentured servants that they sent from England didn't want to work there anymore. And so they needed somebody else to do this job. And they couldn't use Native Americans anymore because Native Americans knew the land. They knew how to escape. Like, you can't enslave somebody in their own city, basically. And they know how to get around. They can just get out and escape and go home, right? So they need somebody else. And who do you think they're going to start turning to get this label, to make this money? Slaves. Right. Africans. So during the 1600s, Africans had become a part of a trade network called the Triangular Trade, the map I just showed y'all, where they traded goods back and forth between Africa, North America, and Europe. They carried rum and other goods from New England to Africa. The merchants brought slaves from Africa to the West Indies, where they sold them for sugar and molasses. The merchants then sold these goods in New England to be distilled into rum. The network also included many minor routes that crisscrossed the northern and southern colonies, the West Indies, Europe, and Africa. The part of the triangular trade that brought Africans to the West Indies and later to North America was called the Middle Passage. Africans made this trip on crowded, dirty ships. Nearly 20% of the Africans aboard each ship died from either cruel treatment or disease. So on these ships, every 2 out of 10 slaves died. Remember, they were packed together. They couldn't hardly breathe. They had to go to the bathroom on themselves because they wouldn't know where to go. And then they had the people around them had to lay in it. So you can imagine the torture that they had to go through. So people caught diseases and people died because it was just hard to breathe. It was hard to live. And you crowded and you can't move. So you can imagine what they had to go through. And they had to endure this for months at a time. So you had to be very strong to survive. Those who survived the trip into their hard life of labor in North America, about 90% of enslaved Africans worked in the fields. The rest worked in planters' houses. Some learned skills such as carpentry. Children began working at age 12. Slaves were treated harshly. Slave owners whipped and beat slaves they considered disobedient or disrespectful. What was life like for enslaved Africans in North America that we just discussed? What was it like for them?
Hard.
It was hard, right? Yeah. They were mistreated, right? All correct. So how did slaves cope in the colonies? Once in America, slaves tried to hold onto their African culture. They wove baskets and created pottery as they had done in their homeland. Slaves also played African music and told traditional stories. Many slaves resisted their position of subservience. Some slaves faked illness to get out of working. They broke tools or worked slow on purpose. Some slaves pushed their resistance into open revolt. In the Stono Rebellion of 1739, a group of slaves killed several plantation owners. So basically, about 20 slaves gathered tools. They went down the street marching. They destroyed homes. They killed their slave owners. And it was just a revolt. However, they were captured. Many of them was executed. But it's just one example of a revolt of many that happened. These slaves eventually were captured and executed. And although no slave revolts in America were successful, there is an example in the slave trade of a country that did achieve their independence through slave revolts. And that was in Haiti. Haiti gained their independence. They were able to overthrow the I think it was the English. So how did enslaved Africans resist slavery? Well, I just talked about. What are some ways? What are some things that they did?
They tried to get back.
They got weapons. They used tools.
Destroy the stuff.
They destroyed the
They tried to
property.
kill their own.
Right. They tried to kill their owners.
They work slow.
They work slow. Right. Great. Excellent. Next slide. Is another slide. Oh. Okay. So, in closing our discussion, we're going to read a book called Kosula. Kosula, Memories of Africa, is about a boy who was on one of the last ships to America. And at the time when he was on the ship, it was illegal to even transport slaves to America. Mhm. So he was on one of those slave ships.
They don't look like. He like that.
You know, it was a cartoon. You know, this is when he was older. Okay, so he was taken from Africa when he was a boy, and then he was taken here. Y'all ever heard of Africa Town?
Yeah.
Man, people be posting it, but
Yeah, I know what it is.
It's in Mobile. It is, and that's where he was taken to. So this story is from a boy who took place. Well, this story took place in Africa Town, and he was brought to Alabama, to Mobile.
Dougie.
Okay. Hi everyone. Since this is a history class, I would like to share a fascinating story with you all today. This is a story about our warriors, our kings and queens of West Africa. The title of this book is Kosula, Memories of Africa. A long time ago, deep in the mountainous village of West Africa, lived a young boy named Kosula. He lived with his father, Aluwale, and his mother, Kondula, along with his brothers and sisters. Kosula came from a royal and wealthy family. His father, Aluwale, was a chief to the king, and his grandfather was an officer to the king. Life was good in our African village. The men in our village were great hunters and fishermen. The African land was very rich and fertile, producing a lot of vegetables, such as yams, beans, and corn in abundance. The fruits were plentiful. We grew pineapples, bananas, coconuts, and melons. We raised domestic animals such as hogs, goats, sheep, and chickens. The people worked together and we traded our food and goods with the surrounding villages. Does it sound like they were poor? No, that's a myth. All Africans were not poor and are not poor today. Not all of them, okay? The land was so plentiful that no one was ever hungry. Everyone in the village had their own land and their own home. The village was surrounded by 2 protective walls with several gates within the walls for security. If our village was ever invaded, we had several gates to escape into the forest. The king of our village was King Akyong. He came from a royal line of kings. He was a very tall and peaceful man, but very strict. He loved and protected his people. The ruler of our village was Chief Awini. He was a tall and very powerful man. He had authority over all the elders in the village. At the age of 14, I had to be trained as a warrior and as a hunter. My older brothers were already in the army. I trained with my best friends, Pale, Asa, Kibi, and Oliver. Just before sunrise, our fathers and elders in the village led us outside of the village to a campsite. First, we trained on how to make bows and arrows and how to shoot. Then we were trained about how to use our spears. Our tribe was peaceful. We only trained in self-defense to protect ourselves from our people, and our people from any outside invaders. It was then time to learn how to hunt. This training would take up to 14 days. After the training was completed, we became warriors in the army. Excuse me. A huge celebration was held back in the village to mark our journey into manhood. As we got closer to the village, we felt the trees vibrating from the sounds of the beating drums in the village. A few years later, the king of Dahomey, Glele, came to our village to trade. He was a very tall and heavy man. He had conquered most of the surrounding villages. He demanded that the king give him a large portion of our crops, but King Akil refused his demands. King Glele was very angry, so him and his army immediately left our village. Later that night, back in Dahomey, King Glele was still very upset. He prepared his army and his Amazon warriors for battle. The Amazon warriors were also known as Nonominto and Mino, meaning our mothers, by the male army. They were an all-female, well-trained military group. They were also the king's bodyguards. Do y'all remember Black Panther? And the whole army was women.
Yeah.
It was kind of an inspired concept, maybe. The king was proud of his army and his Amazon warriors. They have conquered many of the surrounding villages. They even conquered French armies several times. King Glele and his army set out for war. They marched all night through the forest, and just before sunrise, they reached our village. Still dark at this time. Most of the men were out hunting or working in the fields. The women and children were still asleep. The invading army surrounded the village. Standing at each gate, they began to break down the great walls and the gates with their weapons. Meanwhile, I was in my bed asleep. Suddenly, I was awakened by a loud noise, screams, and cries. I grabbed my weapon and ran outside of my home, only to find out that my village was being overrun by the warriors of the home. There was no escape. People were desperately running in all directions. I tried to escape into the forest, but I was captured by one of the Amazon warriors. The walls in my village were completely destroyed. I was taken captives along with some of my people just outside the village. King Akion and Chief Owini were also captured. Most of us were marched through the forest and taken to Wada, near the coast, where we were kept in the barracoon for 21 days. Our group was then sold to an American captain. He marched us to the shore, then through the doors of no return. We were forced to board this huge ship called the Clotilda. We crossed the Atlantic Ocean, never to see our homeland or our people again. We reached the shoreland of Mobile, Alabama in 1860. Most of us were split up and sold to several Alabama plantation owners. After the American Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation, we were freed. But we were left to survive on our own. We tried but failed to return to our beloved homeland, Africa. Since we were not able to return, many of us reunited from various plantations, along with American-born, formerly enslaved men, women, and children. Having our own land was important to us, so we decided to buy our own land and build our own community in the image of Africa. And we called it Africa Town. We then chose our own leaders and judges to govern for our own people. Julie raised her hand and asked, did they have their own doctor in their town? Mr. Clark answered, yes. When they were sick, they were treated by their own African doctors. Tristan raised his hand and asked, did they live in their own houses? Mr. Clark answered, yes, the men worked as masons and carpenters, building their own homes for their families. What kind of food did they eat? Asked Christian. Mr. Clark answered, the hunting and fishing were plentiful in the Alabama forest. They used their own hunting skills they learned in Africa and planted their own vegetable garden. Several of the children were also fascinated. They said in unison, wow, I would love to visit this place. Camilla asked, do they have a school like ours? Yes, like ours, Mr. Clark answered. Education was very important to them. They built their own school, and it's still there in Africa Town today. Then Braylon asked, what else do they have in their town? Mr. Clark answers, well, they have their own grocery store, movie theater, gas station, barbershop, motel, church, post office, and dry cleaner. The people of Africatown formed their own community. Brooklyn raised her hand and asked, did they teach their children about Africa and teach them the African language? Yes, they spoke their own African language and taught their children the African customs, traditions, and how important it is to know about their heritage. The people of Africatown are proud of their rich African heritage. The spirit of Africatown's ancestors still lives on today, and the descendants of those people in Africatown, located in Mobile, Alabama. So, as you can see from the book, they had a distinct history of their own. We had our own towns, our own cities, and we tried to prosper. This is going to conclude my presentation. Thank you all for listening.